are discussing Paul, the Apostle Paul, versus Muhammad, because Muslims have to blame someone for why the message of Islam doesn't line up with the message of Jesus, so they have to say that the message of Jesus has been corrupted. If they know what they're talking about, they realize they can't blame 3rd, 4th century Christians for corrupting the message. They have to blame someone in the 1st century. They can't blame Jesus. They can't blame Jesus' immediate followers. They have to blame the Apostle Paul, someone powerful enough and early enough to corrupt all of the evidence so that the evidence we have just doesn't line up with Islam. So they have to pin it on someone. Paul's all they got. Well, now we're going to go into some specifics. Brother Anthony, you still there? We have Anthony on the line?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, I want to jump into this first. I want to jump into this first point. Paul, as far as his moral status. Now, we don't have to agree with someone theologically to say that person lived, a very good life. I don't agree with Gandhi's theological views, but I would say in many important ways he lived a very good life. The Apostle Paul. If you're not just angry at him, and lots of Muslims who would say nasty things about him have never studied his life, from a historical perspective, what kind of life did the Apostle Paul live?
Well, earlier you mentioned something interesting that popped into my mind when you announced the topic of the show. And that is, it's interesting to think of Paul before his conversion as well as after it, along the way when we're comparing Paul to Muhammad. If we look at Paul prior to his conversion, by the standards of Judaism, Paul was a giant, morally speaking. Now, we would still find blame in things that Paul did. Paul persecuted the church. We definitely don't think that that's a good thing from a Christian standpoint. But by the standards of Judaism, Paul was a Pharisee and had excelled in living up to the requirements of the Jewish religion. He says it was his boast. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He studied under Gamaliel. He was an incredible giant and very robust in terms of his lifestyle. But all the more so then when we contrast Paul now once he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles, once he's called by Christ on the Damascus Road. At that point, Paul showed an incredible resolve and character to serve Jesus. One of my favorite things about the Apostle Paul is his willingness to forego certain rights that were his, all for the sake of the gospel. And one example out of just a whole host of examples is the fact that, according to Paul, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, for example, a person who labors in a particular field has the right to benefit from his labors. For example, a person who plows, a person who threshes has the right to benefit when the harvest comes. In fact, he even uses the example from the law of Moses where it says that an ox has the right to eat while it's treading the threshing floor there. And Paul says that this is not just written for the sake of taking care of animals, but the principle extends to human beings, right? Humans have the right to benefit from their labors. And likewise, he says, people who labor in the gospel ministry have the right to benefit materially from those that they are extending benefit to spiritually, right? And he gives us an example of people who benefited from their labors. He gives the example of Peter and Barnabas in 1 Corinthians 9. Now, here's where I say Paul really stands out, because Paul goes on to say, even though this is his right to the workers worthy of his hire, he says he doesn't use his right to benefit from his labors, but chose to support himself with his own hands. As you guys know, Paul was a tent maker, and every city he went to, he paid for his travels, he paid for his food, he paid for his lodging, he paid for everything, even though he had a right to be taken care of by those that he was blessing through his preaching and teaching. And so I think Paul just stands out here as a spiritual giant in this regard. This is very different.
Brother Anthony. I'm thinking of one more right that Paul would have had that he didn't take advantage of, because this will be a huge contrast with the life of Muhammad. Can you give us another example of a right that Paul would have had that he didn't take advantage of?
Oh, gosh, there's so many. He had
Well,
the right.
yeah. Well, I'm thinking specifically of his right to have along a believing wife with him.
Right, and that's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 9 as well. He had the right to have a wife. Peter had a wife, Barnabas, and they took their wives with them on their missionary journeys. Of course, they weren't out on jihad, which is why they could take their women with them. But he had that right, but he didn't use it. There's nothing wrong with having a wife. There's nothing wrong with making money. But Paul wanted to have this in his favor, that he wasn't doing this for gain. Nobody could say that Paul was doing this to gain a following, to get power, to get money, to satisfy his lusts and his cravings and his, all these sorts of seedy things. None of this had any place in Paul. And that's very different, as you guys well know, than what we see in Muhammad.
Now, as far as material, worldly gain, what did Paul get out of Christianity?
Nothing I can think of. Paul was often in prison. Sometimes in prison, he even writes to Timothy and tells him to bring his coat. He's languishing in a prison, cold, right? They didn't have internal heating and all that sort of thing. This is what Paul got on earth for serving Christ and proclaiming the gospel so that men and women might be saved. He had to ask for a coat. Nothing else to speak of to his name.
And so, if I'm to understand you correctly, Paul says, according to the moral law, right? A moral law that he would hold other people to, he could make his entire living off his preaching, live very well off his preaching, have a wife along with him while he's preaching. He could have lived a very comfortable life and not have been doing anything wrong, but he chose to live with additional hardships and without those comforts. In other words, he held himself to a more difficult, more rigorous standard than he would apply to other people.
Right, absolutely.
And so, CL, I have to wonder now, what do we find the same thing with Muhammad?
Well, that's very interesting. I think Muhammad had a different philosophy when it came to relations and marriage.
Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and because we already talked about the Apostle Paul thinking it's okay, believing it's okay to marry a woman, to bring her along on your journeys and so on, so that you've had a rough day, you still get to come home to your wife every night, even if you're on a missionary journey. Muhammad, how would Muhammad compare to that?
Well, first thing that stood out when Anthony was speaking and he was reciting the Bible, he said a wife. Mm-hmm. Paul had a right to a wife. Now, the advice that Muhammad gave to his followers, well, they could certainly have a wife, but they could have 2 wives, or maybe 3 wives, but a limit to 4 wives.
Okay, so we know that Muhammad is going to, if he's like the Apostle Paul, he's going to hold himself at least to that standard. Or if he's like the Apostle Paul, he's going to put some more restrictions on himself. So even though Muslims in general can have 4 wives, he might limit himself to 1 or to none, like the Apostle Paul, right?
No. You don't understand that he is the worthy one, the praiseworthy one. So with him being the praiseworthy one, you can't just limit him to what other people, the other believers have. Mm-hmm. He was given special privileges by Allah.
So he didn't hold himself to a more disciplined, stricter set of rules. He actually got special treatment because of his special place with Allah.
He had a lot more than 4 wives. And there is a hadith where he pretty much bragged about his ability to satisfy his harem of wives in one night.
And this is, and so he would have sex with all 9 of his wives in one day. And I mean, think about that. Our Muslim friends out there, think about the difference already. This is 1 point, right? This is 1 point. 1 point. The Apostle Paul says, all you Christians out there, you can have a wife. Me, I'm not going to. I have a special dedication to God. I'm not even going to take time for that. I'm too busy going out and preaching, and I'm eventually going to get tortured and killed. I'm not going to take advantage of that right I have to a wife. And you have Muhammad saying Muslims have the right to 4 wives. unless you're me. You get 4, I get more, right? Because I'm the prophet, so I get special moral privileges. I don't have to follow the same rules laid down by Allah in the Quran. I get special moral privileges. Just on that one point, do you really not see a problem here? Because if I were a Muslim, this would really bother me. False prophets come along and they have the opportunity, once they've won a number of followers, they have an opportunity to give themselves these special privileges. When you see the Apostle Paul, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He holds himself to a higher standard. And Muhammad, well, I don't have to follow the rules of everyone else. Yeah?
Well, I was just looking at one of the hadith in question. Mm-hmm. This one is from, there are 2 in Bukhari and 1 in Muslim. And the narrator, which is Qatada, he says about the Prophet Muhammad, because someone asked him, did he have the strength to be with all these women, all his wives in one night? Well, he says about the Prophet Muhammad, supposed prophet, we used to say that the Prophet was given the strength of 30 men. So he had the sexual drive of 30 men. Mm-hmm. So how could you expect such a man to just keep himself to 4 women?
Okay, we couldn't even imagine bragging about like the Apostle Paul in this. Oh man, he could hump a lot of women. Oh man, what a man! Ah, right. And that's what your Muslim sources say about your prophet. And the reason we point this out, Muslims, is you Muslims, especially Muslims who live in the West, you don't believe in this Muhammad. You don't believe in the Muhammad that's laid down in your sources because you haven't read those sources. You believe in this Muhammad who was this pure, chaste, wonderful individual, never do anything, and that's not the Muslim we read about in your sources. So are all your sources wrong? Because the Muhammad we read about, he didn't just have sex with 9 women at one time. Think about who these women were. You're talking about Aisha, his child bride. She'd been a couple years older by the time he had the 9, but a girl he had sex with before she'd reached the age of puberty, when she was 9 years old, setting a precedent for all other Muslims. You have Zainab, the divorced wife of his own adopted son. This is his adopted son's wife who gets a divorce because Muhammad starts lusting after her. And you go on down the list, the captives that he takes in battle and so on. This is why I said earlier, this is someone I would not listen to tell me about God. And on the issue of morality, we can go on forever. So if you have questions about Muhammad's moral life compared to the Apostle Paul, by all means, give us a call. We want to go on to the issue of his spiritual reliability, and we're going to go to our brother Anthony on the spiritual reliability of the Apostle Paul. But before we do, we wanted to take a caller. We have a caller on the line? Hey, who do we have on the line here?
Hello, shalom.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Thank you. I'm from Indonesia, but I live in Australia.
Yeah, I hear a little bit of an Australian accent there.
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, I'd like to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ according to the Quran.
Okay.
Yeah. We can prove that besides Allah is the best of the deceivers, we can prove from the Quran, the Quran that Allah is also broke His promise. The promise is like this. But first of all, I'd like to show you that Surah 21. Verse 35 says that every soul shall taste death. And then if we go to Surah 4, verse 157 about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, in that it was not Jesus who was crucified, that means Jesus never tastes death. So, in this case, and if we go to Surah 3, verse 55, in there, Allah promised that Jesus would cause to death. Allah would cause Jesus to death, and then I forget the verse, but it says that every what do we call it? Sorry, I'm nervous. In the meantime, my English is not good enough. It says that in Surah Ibrahim, I think I might call back later.
Okay.
I'll find out the surah.
Okay, and if I was understanding the point, and we'll hand it over to Brother Anthony to talk about the spiritual reliability of the Apostle Paul. But I think the brother was trying to make a point about the Quran repeatedly, chapter 3, verse 185, I think, and several passages in the Quran talk about everyone's going to die. Every soul shall taste death. No. Jesus says, peace on me, the day I was born, the day I die, and so on. So Jesus talks about dying. Jesus is going to die, and yet according to the Quran, Jesus didn't die. Now, just to give you the Muslim reconciliation of that, what's going to happen? Is Jesus never going to die? Give us the Muslim reconciliation.
Well, he didn't die at the time when the Jews came to arrest him, as we different speculations, someone else was put on the cross, whatever. But he was raised up to Allah, right, where he's still alive in the heavens. He's going to return at the end of time, right, to fight the Dajjal, the Antichrist. He will rule an Islamic state, then he will die.
Mm-hmm. So the Islamic reconciliation of everyone's going to die, but Jesus didn't die, is that Jesus is going to come back, and then he's going to die.
Yes.
So the Quran will turn out to be true.
Every nafs shall die.
Mm-hmm.
But Allah says he has a nafs.
Mm-hmm. Uh-oh. That's a different problem. You're on a different problem there. So, brother, now here's the thing. Given just what the Quran says, because the Quran doesn't explain all that about Jesus, coming back and then dying and then having children and this and that, killing all the pigs. The Quran doesn't explain a lot about that. If you go into the Hadith, there would be a reconciliation. If you went to the Quran, you wouldn't get that impression. You'd see the tension that you pointed out. So unless it's a Quran-only Muslim, they do have a way of reconciling. Again, you wouldn't get that impression from the Quran, I don't think. But there is a reconciliation. So I don't think it's a straightforward contradiction. All right, now on to the spiritual reliability of the Apostle Paul versus the spiritual reliability of Muhammad. We can compare two people morally. But these are not just people who are living moral lives. These are people who are claiming to receive divine revelations. They're getting revelations from God. And so we have to think that these people are in a correct spiritual position, that we could trust them, that we don't think this person is nuts. So, Brother Anthony, you there?
I am.
On a spiritual level, if you knew the Apostle Paul, and let's say you knew the Apostle Paul for years, you're familiar with his writings, with his life, why would you trust the Apostle Paul that this is someone I can trust on spiritual matters?
Okay, well, among the many things that we could mention here, just like we could have mentioned many things on the moral question, one thing is that we know that in Scripture, often God would attest or confirm the truth of what a person was proclaiming by attending their witness with his own witness. That is, he would perform supernatural signs and wonders. We see in the case of Paul, for example, in Acts 13, where he strikes Elymas the sorcerer blind because he was trying to turn the proconsul against the faith. Similarly, in Acts 14, we see that Paul heals a lame guy, a guy who was lame since birth. In Acts 16, we see Paul delivers a demon from a girl that enabled her to, predict the future. Apparently, in Acts 20, we see that Paul he brought back Eutychus from the dead. He fell out of a second-story window, and then Paul raises him from the dead. And we can go on and on with examples of Paul's witness being confirmed by God through supernatural wonders. Now, somebody will say, I think, at this point, that miracles are not necessary to prove that somebody is a prophet. For example, we have John the Baptist who didn't perform any miracles, and that's true enough. That that's not a necessary mark of prophethood. However, it is a mark of prophethood when it is present, and a person can't say, in this case, in the case of Paul, that he's simply performing. These are lying signs and wonders, like a false prophet might perform, because Deuteronomy 13 says that. We're not to listen to a person even if they perform a wonder if they contradict God's revelation. Well, they can't say that here in the case of Paul, because the wonders that Paul is performing are undoing the work of Satan. Remember, he's opposing Elymas the sorcerer, something condemned in the law of God. He delivers a girl from a demon, something that Jesus did in his ministry. And to confirm that, as a legitimate work of God, Jesus said if he was performing these miracles by the power of Satan, then it would show that Satan's kingdom was opposed to itself, in which case it wouldn't be able to stand. And so Jesus, proves that his miracles aren't being performed by Satan. And so by the same token, we can say that Paul's miracles weren't being performed by the power of Satan either. And when we turn to Muhammad, in contrast to Paul, again, as you guys know, Muhammad had no miracles. He was constantly asked to perform a miracle or show a sign, and he couldn't come up with anything.
Now, Brother Anthony, I have to play devil's advocate here. I happen to know that the Hadith are filled with stories of Muhammad performing miracles. What would be the problem with that?
Well, although I don't buy the science of Hadith as enunciated by or worked out by Muslims, nevertheless, on their own criteria, a hadith is judged as sound or unsound based on whether or not it agrees with the Qur'an. So if we turn to the Qur'an and we see that it repudiates the notion that Muhammad performed signs, and then we find a hadith that is collected hundreds of years later saying that he did, then we know that an embellishment has taken place, much like we see in many other pagan religions, much like Muslims try and claim took place in the case of Jesus, but we've already addressed that. It's there from the very beginning in the case of Jesus. But here in Surah 11:12, to give one example, we read, this is the Shakir translation, it says, "Then it may be that you will give up part of what is revealed to you, and your breast will become straightened by it, because they say, why has not a treasure been sent down upon him, or an angel come with him?" Okay, so they're asking, why hasn't some token or evidence of God being with him and of him being a prophet been sent down to him? And the verse concludes, "You are only a warner, and Allah is custodian over all things." So here, the verse says he doesn't have any wonder or sign to give them because he's only a warner. So the later contradictory hadiths would have to be dismissed by Muslims' own criteria of hadith criticism.
So what we have is that the Apostle Paul receives the greatest kind of spiritual confirmation that you can receive, that you can receive from God, namely repeated miraculous signs and wonders. And we don't find the same thing for Paul. But as Anthony pointed out, miracles aren't necessary. So not having any miracles doesn't mean we can't trust Muhammad as a prophet, but are there other reasons, CL, that we shouldn't trust Muhammad?
Can I throw one thing in here?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Real quickly, though, there's a problem in the case of Muhammad. There's a snag because he claims to be the prophet like Moses that was predicted in Deuteronomy 18. Mm-hmm. And that prophet, according to Deuteronomy 34, had to perform miracles in the sight of all Israel. So it is a disqualifying factor for Muhammad, but although there are others.
So there are prophets down through history who didn't perform miracles. It wouldn't be a problem for them, but because of the specific criteria Muhammad is supposed to meet, it is a problem for him.
Right.
Okay. Now, on the spiritual reliability, let's pretend that there's not that problem. On the spiritual reliability of Muhammad, anything else that would call his spiritual stability in question here?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that he had no assurance of his own personal salvation. That seems like a big thing to me. Mm-hmm. Actually, when I was Muslim, that was something that gave me pause and reservations, that I was dedicating myself to this religion, following the Sunnah and the Quran, and I really didn't have any guarantee or assurance that I wasn't going to get tossed into hell by Allah. because nobody knows what Allah will do. He's arbitrary. He can do whatever he wants to.
And by the way, this actually ties into some of the things we were saying earlier about the crucifixion of Jesus. When you believe, and the brother who called in, he pointed out that Allah, according to the Quran, is the greatest of deceivers. That's Surah 3, verse 54. It won't say that in your translation. It won't say that in your translation, but that is what the Quran says, the greatest of deceivers. And if you don't know what that means, think about it. Allah tricks and deceives people into believing Jesus died on the cross. Why does he do that? And the answer is, there's no reason. There's no reason for Allah to trick and deceive those people into believing Jesus. It wasn't to protect Jesus. Jesus was safe in heaven. So why does he do it? Apparently Allah just likes to trick and deceive people. And that's the problem. This was such a huge problem for the early Muslim community. Abu Bakr said if he had 1 foot in paradise, he would still fear Allah's makr, his deception. Now, that's why Muhammad can say, and what you were thinking of is Muhammad saying, I don't know what will happen with you or with me, right? He doesn't know. Muhammad doesn't know. And we have to take a break, but we have callers to take when we get back. So just to wrap up this issue of spiritual reliability, you have the Apostle Paul going, raising the dead, curing people, and then you have Muhammad, who doesn't even know what's going to happen to him when he dies. And you Muslims out there who believe you're going to heaven, if your own prophet didn't know what was going to happen to him after death, where does that put you? And if we wanted to sort of round out the spiritual reliability, you'd have to include things like Muhammad's first impression of his revelations was that they were demonic. Read your sources. Muhammad, when he had that encounter with what he later claimed was Gabriel, his first impression was that he was encountering a demon. Very important considering what the Apostle Paul said about Satan transforming himself into an angel of light. You have that. You have the satanic verses where Muhammad delivers revelations to his followers, promoting polytheism, comes back later and says, sorry, the devil tricked me into doing that. I couldn't tell the difference between those revelations. I couldn't tell the difference between the revelation from God and the revelation from Satan. It's in your sources. You don't know about it because you don't read your sources. Muhammad was a victim of black magic. He started acting weird for between 6 months and 2 years, having delusional thoughts and false beliefs. Finally, he snaps out of it. Jewish magician got me, cast a spell on me. This is the guy you're trusting on all these matters. You're trusting with your salvation a guy who didn't know where he was going and who thought he was demon-possessed for a time, who couldn't tell the difference between a revelation from God and a revelation from the devil, and who was wide open for spiritual attack from magicians? I mean, this goes back to me saying earlier why this is the last guy I would ever trust.
Well, didn't he also want to commit suicide because he didn't want to be a possessed
poet? He became suicidal, tried to hurl himself off a cliff repeatedly. This is a wild guy. But certainly not someone we would trust on a spiritual level. But there are other comparisons. We're going to get back to those. We're going to have to take some callers when we come back here in just a moment on Jesus or Muhammad.